Some of you have attended before, some of you are new. We've been running these power chats since the first week of lockdown quarantine. We run them for a half hour. So the goal is to be in and out and provide value pretty quickly. I'm Ruben Lavavi. I'm founder of Power Forward Group. Power Forward Group is a full service financial advisory / planning firm based in Midtown Manhattan, but we have clients across the nation through Zoom in a non-pandemic world. Sometimes we get to see them in person when we get to fly out, but that's off the table right now. Power Forward Group is a no minimum firm. We believe all clients deserve the right to have a financial plan, and we don't charge planning fees. Our goal is as you grow, we grow. We want to start off early in your careers and help you grow and get there, or earlier where you are towards your goals and help you achieve your goals as quick as you can. So I'm kind of excited for today's chat with Paula because we're both attorneys who do things that are more fun than being just attorneys, right? We've seen the light is the way I'll say it. So I thought I was going to be an attorney, and here I am as a financial advisor, and I tell people I can do a little legal work. The last time Paula and I were together, we were presenting at an event called More Than Esquires, which is like-minded attorneys who want to do things beyond just boring law. So Paula's founded Inclusion Strategies. I think you founded Inclusion Strategies, correct, Paula?
Inclusion Strategy Solutions, yes. Yes.
And, Paula gets to work on, I think, what I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's her life mission every day, beyond just saying, hey, I'm going to bill for legal work. So tell us what got you there, Paula, and give us a little bit of the background.
So as we just mentioned, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I had the opportunity to, when I was in high school, or for high school, to go to boarding school in Massachusetts. When I went to boarding school, I was one of 20 students of color at the boarding school. And that really started me on my path of thinking about how to bring together people who are different, but are really very, very similar. And so I was navigating lots of conversations with people who were different than me because they were either financially in a better space than my family had been, or from different areas of the world, because it was a global, people came from all over the place. And then I decided for college, I was going to go to UMass Amherst, which is wonderful, which is another place in which there's so much diversity. And then I met a guy, and that guy encouraged me to move to California, which again expanded my my world, in that I had never woken up and seen mountains in the same, other than Bear Mountain is not the same. And really loved having that experience where each time I shifted in places, I got to meet new and different people, and realized I was really kind of good at navigating spaces of difference and enjoying connections. That guy didn't work out, thankfully. And I moved back to New York after September 11th because my mother was in the towers, and we had to really convene as a family in order to be sort of healed from that experience. And so I moved back here to New York and decided to go to law school. And I went to CUNY Law School because, frankly, when I visited, I think 4 of the schools here in New York. CUNY was the one in which I felt the most at home. People were really supportive. Lots of folks who were studying for the bar stopped to tell me about their experience, and I just thought, this is someplace I want to be. And because I wanted to go to law school aligned with the lawyers who I'd worked with when my mother was killed, I wanted to help people, but I didn't really know what that meant, right? And so CUNY was the right place. It was a public interest law school, but I realized pretty quickly after I graduated that I didn't want to actually practice law, and that I'm better in terms of the value add with using the legal foundations to make those connections. And I started with doing diversity and inclusion work within the law school space. So I worked at 3 different law schools. I have chaired 4 different committees at various bar associations, and I'm the immediate past president of the Metropolitan Black Bar, which is the largest Black bar association here in New York City, or New York State. So I have a variety of things that I do for clients, but for my sort of how I add value to the world, it's with my thought leadership, it's with my interrogating what people know as true, to really make them think about who and what they are and who they want to be, and that might mean individually and that might be collectively, in order to add additional value. And so I'm on 6 different boards, and then the work that I do is advancing inclusion within organizations. And for now, my phone is ringing off the hook given what's happening in the country at this moment.
Right. So obviously it's something we're going to want to talk about. And I mean, to be, frank, that's kind of you know, we had met before, but that's what cued my brain is, hey, we should have Paula on because you spoke so wonderfully about this before.
Mhm.
Just from your own personal story, right? So coming out of September 11th and feeling together as a family, can you draw an analogy? Is this time that we're going through now similar, or do you feel like it's very different? Do you feel like it's fractured? Do you feel like it can be a time of healing?
I think there are definitely some similarities. Similarities in that when we have times of crisis, people tend to want to stick with people who are like them. Right. And so I remember when, you know, we had to do a lot of things in terms of the Victims Compensation Fund and things that were happening here in New York after 9/11. And there were lots of people who wanted to align and really there was a large anti-Muslim sentiment at that time in the city. And one of the ways that I sort of spoke up was to say, this is not who we can be right now. Right. Right. It's not a whole religion that did this. It is these people who decided to do this and commit this crime. It's not all of them. It's not the sort of vastness of who they are as a culture and as a religion that executed this incident. And that I think for a lot of people really was helpful in that you heard somebody who, and listen, my mother was killed, right? I was saying that she still would not want this to be the case, right? In terms of my understanding and how she raised me. Now, in the middle of this pandemic, you know, when we have communities of color being detrimentally affected by this pandemic in lots of ways because they're on the front lines in terms of the work and things that we need in order to succeed as a society. There is that sort of shifting. And then, you know, everything that's happened in the last 4 weeks with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless more names that exist and protests that existed because of that. Now there's that inclination, I think, to want to separate, but an understanding now based on all of us seeing this trauma that occurred for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to George Floyd, that we can't, right? We have to find ways in which to come together. So there are some similarities, right? We're in crisis. We were in crisis then and we're definitely in crisis now. But I think there's a lot more opportunity because some of the fear is lessened, although for some communities, the fear is escalated. It just really just depends on your perspective and where you're coming to this from.
Right. Well, one thing I think that's really interesting about topics you've discussed before is about individuality and inclusion, right? So maintaining your individual self and kind of messaging while creating an inclusive environment. So I think that's something we're definitely going through right now, for sure.
Right. Yes.
In terms of your career path, is that something you personally felt growing up into the law market, or was it really just coming through school and then creating that?
It's sort of a hybrid. I have always understood, based on how my parents, my family, and other stakeholders in my life have committed to me that you are an individual, right? You are special because you're all the things that your parents say to you when you're younger. But I understood that it was not just my race. It was not just where I'm from. It was not just the outfit I wore. It's all of the things that made me special. So when we go into organizations and talk about diversity, I say, even if the room looks exactly the same, if everybody in the room is, or, you know, it's quadruplets in the room, you still have diversity because they're not the same, right? And being able to understand who we are individually really helps us to understand how we can be better collectively. So oftentimes I'll talk about personal branding and what we do in order to present ourselves to the world. And what part of that is our race, our gender, and all the things that we look at traditionally as visual diversity, but that's not just the only part of it. And oftentimes when I do diversity work within organizations, you know, I'll have white men say to me, well, I don't think there's any space here for me. I don't know where, you know, how can I add value to this? As if they're sort of a ancillary part of the conversation, when in fact they're integral to the conversation on diversity, equity, inclusion. But it's one thing to have diversity. It's another thing to have inclusion. And what's happening right now is that communities of color, in particular Black employees, pretty much all over this country, are saying, we have not felt included in your organization, right? Or we felt included only at entry levels and not in leadership, or we don't see a pathway for us, right? So that when you don't have ability to navigate and grow and be mentored and sponsored and escalate and elevate, it shows that inclusion doesn't exist in the same way, right? Because what we do as individuals is we align with people who are like us, right? It's human being bias. you likely have lots of friends who are similar to you. That might be racially, that might be your schooling, that, there's a lot of ways that we connect with each other that can be barriers when we're trying to increase and advance diversity. And one of the things I do when I go into organizations is shine a light on that, right? I say, like, who are the people in your sphere? Who are the top 10 people who you trust? And if there's a similarity there, you need to not fire those people, right? But see how you can be a little more open. What are the blind spots that you might have to people feeling that they're included when they're with and around or working for you?
Right. I think it creates a lot of value, because even outside of whether it's race, whether it's social, like, what do I do on an everyday basis? What do Power Forward group advisors do on an everyday basis? We speak to clients, right? The client the first time, you need to hear their story. You need to understand where they're coming from, because without that, you don't create the personal connection where you can then add value throughout the life cycle. You can do a service, but to actually be an advisor and sit there and understand where they're coming from creates, I think, crossing that boundary, which I think you need openness to get to. So how do you get an organization to become self-reflective enough where they find a need for your services, right? I think that the hardest part is saying, hey, we need to add this value to our organization.
Yeah, so how people come to me varies. So it's either proactively, like, we understand that we can do better. We have been reflective on the fact that our C-suite looks the same way, or that we are trying to institute a pipeline and it hasn't been working. But oftentimes it's like now, where it's responsive, right? The world is, is going essentially way out of the bounds in which we have lived in, right? Our normal is very abnormal right now. And our employees, our clients, our friends, our colleagues, everyone is looking for us to be responsive to this and to act. And so we need help. And so I say that those are the two ways that normally people will come to me, but it doesn't mean it's easy, right? So sometimes when people come proactively, they will come proactively, but with skepticism, right? Like, what is this diversity thing? And when it's responsive, there's usually resistance and anger, right? Like, oh, this is not what we had planned for 2020, or, we didn't budget for this, or, a myriad of other reasons as to why or what. Oftentimes there's a leader who will say, let's have a conversation, but when it's not, when it's like groundswell, when it's, people like, we need this to happen, that resistance is the first thing that we need to work on in an organization. And so I often coach leaders and C-suite folks to say, look, here's what value you can find from committing here. Here's why, as a leader, you're actually not leading as well as you could if you're not committing to diversity and inclusion. And here's why you don't need to be afraid to do so, because here's why you can own up to a mistake if you make one, and here's how you can do better, and here's how we can partner to help you to frame and shape what you want to do as an organization. And what they do varies, but it usually is, doing sort of an assessment. And this is the scary part, right? Nobody wants constructive feedback, but we go in and we say, look.
We say it, but it's a question of whether we really want it.
Exactly. So we go in and say, we're going to do an anonymous survey of your organization. We're not going to ask for race, gender, any of those things, but we're going to ask for perceptions on what diversity and inclusion is internally, and if what you're saying and what you're doing matches. And we kind of like go under the beds and into the closets and hear all of the things. And that's a scary place for any leader in any organization to be in. But the key is, there is a shift usually in employees when they even have the ask happen, right? Like, oh, now you care, right? But that can't happen in an echo chamber. That can't happen in a vacuum. It has to be the ask, and then what are you going to do? And that's the second scary part, right? Because you ask, and then people say, you're good at this, you're not good at this. You should be doing this, or you're all words and no action, or we don't have any people of color in the C-suite, or the way that you interact and manage women is bad. Whatever the things that you might hear is challenging, and then you have to be able to say from that, what are we going to do, right? And what are we going to do could be strategic planning. It could be, instituting training. It could be a myriad of those things. It could be coaching, as I mentioned. And what happens in an organization really depends on that organization. We don't do anything out of the box. It really depends on what we learn. Like, it's like, you go to a doctor, you get to triage, figure out what's going on, and then we say, here's our recommendations. And the thing is, especially this year, what happened with COVID-19, is that people are like, we had to lay people off, or, we're thinking about the fact that we're going into a recession or are in a recession. So where do we find resources in order to do the things that are being requested of us, right? So those are all challenges that we experience, and yet it still needs to be done.
Right. Right. In some ways, right. In some ways it's harder, but in other ways, I think we're doing a virtual event right now, right? In some ways, more rooms at the same time for less work or less time, I think, and getting. So I think this is a perfect time for organizations to self-reflect. How much of the problems comes from really hiring practices are you seeing, or is it really once we have an organization, there's kind of internal problems? Does it all start with hiring?
It's both, right? So a lot of times you can get people in, and in the organizations in which there's not diversity and you're not getting people in, there's usually an issue in that managers who are hiring managers are not trained to interview properly, and bias is being allowed. There's no barriers to bias instituted in the actual recruiting process, right? So you're not recruiting from the right places, or whoever's screening the interviews has bias that's affecting what the pipeline that comes in. And then, you know, the hiring managers are asking questions to certain candidates in one way and other candidates in the other, or there's not a panel of people who are interviewing, it's just one person, right? You think about every single step in your recruiting process has the ability for bias to exist, right? If I look at a resume and I say, "Ooh, Paula, that sounds like a Black name," then I might not, and even if I don't say it consciously, I might think, well, I had a friend that was named Paula and she got on my nerves. All right, and it might just click that I don't like that, right? So there has to be other ways. We have lots of clients who do blind resumes so that you don't have the name and you don't have the location. You just have their skill set and their experience. So it depends on that. The other piece is the retention piece. You get the people in, and then there's not a good evaluation process. There's no way of giving good feedback consistently. There's not an elevation path. There's not people that folks can look to for mentorship or sponsorship, or there's not any community internally. So there's a lot of different reasons internally as to why there may not be retention, right? And people might not feel included, but oftentimes it's both. You know, oftentimes it's both the recruiting and the retention.
Right. And you've been doing this for almost over 20 years, right? And do you see the environment getting better? Do you see that there's a broader impact, or do you think this is still an issue that we're struggling with?
I think that we are still terrible at having conversations.
Yeah.
I think we as a global community are not good with communication. And because of that, people are either too afraid to have difficult conversations, which need to happen, or when they are given feedback about some way in which they're communicated, they then retract and get defensive, as opposed to wanting to continue to engage so that they can progress and people can feel that they are heard, right? Every employee wants to be fully heard and fairly treated. Okay, I say that probably every single day. But the issue is that we're not communicating well. You know, like, I had lots of clients who reached out in the past 2 weeks to say, Paula, you need to come in and we need to do anti-racism training. And I say to them, have you done unconscious bias training? Have you done anything with diversity at all? And they say no. And I say, so you want me to come into the organization and start with anti-racism? People, like, think about the dialogues about race that we've had in this country, right? Regardless of what's happened now, that's a hard place to start, and often a place of you have people who are very sort of grounded in their beliefs and haven't had the opportunity to exercise empathy or to understand some of the systemic and structural things that have caused racism to occur. And that is not a good entry place for any conversation. So it really does start with, hi, people who are in an organization, what is it you need? What are the frustrations you have? Based on the knowledge we then have there, what are we going to do strategically in order to address those things? Then, what else do we need? Is it training? Is it coaching? Is it, right? And it's usually a combination of those things. But I would say, given, particularly around racism, you know, Brian Stevenson, who is one of my favorite people, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, activist on mass incarceration, wonderful lawyer. He says that until America really responds and apologizes essentially for its part in racism occurring the way it is now, that we'll never be where we are. And I think that right now what's happening is that we're forcing reflection, right? And we're forcing the people to look at the continuum of what racism has been for the past 400 years in this country. And whether we want it or not, it's happening. And so I think that no matter what, there's going to be a shift, and we can all feel it. We know there's a shift happening. Like, look at literally symbols that we have known in our whole lives are toppling daily, right? What we know for sure is no longer sure. And that's a scary thing for some people. It is. But I think there are ways that we can start to have conversations and dialogues so we can all get to next steps. It's not overnight. This didn't happen overnight, and it won't be better overnight either. But we can't be silent, and we can't be stagnant.
Right. I think it's great that you're starting from like the biggest and the largest question. You kind of whittle down to fit within what the organization can do. I mean, that's not a personal. I mean, that's what we see, right? What creates success is kind of the first question, and kind of figure out the steps there. We have some great questions in the chat box.
Sure.
So Bernadette asked, how do you make resumes colorblind to internal hiring? Great question.
So, and it's usually not an internal hiring strategy. It's usually only an external because people do know each other. But there are ways in the application process, right, that some of the initial ways of vetting don't have specifics, like may not have the actual department you're in. It really depends on the organization, its structure. It oftentimes what we'll recommend is to say the initial interview for an internal hire has to have at least 5 people on it.
Right.
Right. And then those 5 people have to rate the candidates solo and using the same rubric. And then how you go forward is based on their responses without conversation. Right. Then it narrows down, right? Because then at least if there's a fairer process, because what will happen is when you have a conversation, whomever the sort of, bigger person in the room will say, well, that, whoever that was, and it will shape what people's responses are. And so we're trying to narrow that or lessen the opportunity for some of those things that have bias come into it to happen in internal and also in external hiring. Good question. Thanks for that.
Florence asks, how can you deal with the perception of reverse racism or discrimination?
With education, reverse racism is not a thing. So we can talk about bias because everyone can experience bias, everyone can experience stereotypes, but it really is education. If we talk about what the definition of racism is, once you understand that it's power-based, et cetera, then you can't have reverse racism. And that is just a language shift, right? Saying, here's the definition we're working with, and here's why. Conversations about that, right? Right now, when you have people who are feeling unsettled.
Reverse racism doesn't exist because it's a co-opting of the term. Is that, I just want to understand.
No, literally the definition of racism speaks to power and structures and right, and so you cannot have reverse racism. It would have to mean a power shift, which has not occurred.
It's a bastard of the term.
Right. So it's people saying that I also experience bias, which is absolutely true. Right. Everyone experiences bias, and so we explain that. Yes, you can have an organization that has maybe all Black leadership and have white employees feel as if they're not treated well, but that's not reverse racism, right? That is bias based on their race towards white people. That could happen, absolutely, but it's not reverse racism. So we'll talk about that.
Racism is tied into a power shift.
Right, and it's structural. Like it's not individually. You can say you're a racist, right? But your actions are biased based on constructs of racism. Right, based on, right, so it's again, that's why training is so important, right, because we bat around these words all the time that are not that we don't know the definitions of, like we don't know the history of, and that's why education is such a big piece. That's what I'm very excited about right now. People are doing that self-education piece that they should have done years ago, that we should have had when we were in school, but we didn't have it because of all of the different reasons that we talked about. Yeah, so do you want me to answer the question about coaching?
Yeah, sure. Let's hit the coaching question.
So I think, yes, I do think that firms, any type of firm or organization should have coaching, but specifically for diverse associates within law firms, yes, it should be a part of the suite of things that are offered as a support. Because you don't have generally lots of partners of color within an organization. And we know that when associates of color are not supported, they tend to leave. If you have a coach, it can help them engage, strategize, and deal with issues of bias that occur in a way that doesn't have a detrimental effect on them, right? Assuming that the coach is one that is hired by the firm, but does not have the sort of requirement to report back with specifics.
Right. It has to be it has to be a relationship between the attorney and the
Exactly.
I think it's very important. Guys, if there's any other questions, we have another 2-3 minutes with Paula. Feel free to hit us with those questions. Paula, how does an organization, well, we're going to drop a survey in the chat box also for everybody. How does an organization find you and use your services?
You find me from my myriad of websites. So I'm inclusionstrategy.com, paulaedgar.com. I live on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is my favorite place to be. I'm also on Twitter. I got someone reached out to me on Instagram the other day. So you can find, I'm probably the easiest person to find. So any of those ways are, you know, none of them are preferable. It doesn't matter, but do reach out, particularly if you're having challenges right now. You know, we don't like for things to fester. Makes it harder.
And then a quick question on Paula Edgar, right? So at its base, you're a business owner who's created a brand for herself.
Mhm.
How has that process gone, and what has been the most essential parts of your kind of online brand?
Oh, the essential part of my online brand and my life in general is my authenticity. I come to the space of diversity and inclusion, which is a very challenging space for many people, as my authentic self. So I'm going to talk about being from Brooklyn. I'm going to tell you that I'm Aquarius, like things that you might. I'm not buttoned up, and that helps people to relax, and especially when it's tense. I'll always have paulaedgar.com no matter what business I have, because my personal brand is the foundation of everything that I do. Right. So it's why I tell people to go to multiple sites, because one is only about me and the other is about the business that I have and me. So I encourage people to follow me on social media, because I talk about anything from the BET Awards to how to topple racism. Right. It sort of depends. And when you can connect with someone and find those places of similarity, it's much easier to do this work.
Right. So everything comes out of being the real Paula, which is probably
Absolutely.
a super happy attorney. Unlike
I've been happier than I am now, because I've definitely this whole quarantine and such is challenging, but I try to find joy every single day, and we should all do that.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Paula. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in the room.
Hi,
We dropped
Annie.
the contact in there. Feel free to contact us. Feel free to contact Paula, and keep on joining us as we enjoy our content.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ruben.
everybody.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Paula.
Thanks, everybody.